Hello, friends. Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly Podcast, and welcome back to episode 81. This one is entitled, There Is No Right to Free Speech, and I really hope that triggered people. Triggered lots of libertarians. That's kind of the point. Although there is truth behind that statement, and I'll get into that. This is intended to be a bit of a shorter episode, which I'm coming to find that I say that every time, and then it ends up being like, 37 minutes. But so before I get into the contents, I just appeared on the Foreign Policy Focus podcast with my good buddy Kyle Anzalone. Usually Kyle's appearing on Liberty Weekly, but in this case I finally joined Foreign Policy Focus to talk about FBI entrapment schemes and the common law history of FBI entrapment, or the history of the entrapment defense. And entrapment is actually a legal principle that I frown upon, the entrapment defense. And the only reason why entrapment came about as a defense is because of legal positivism. So I would suggest everyone check that out. Legal positivism and the progressive era is something that I've been talking about quite a bit lately, especially its influence on modern policing. They don't like to call the current state of affairs, they don't like to call that legal positivism. They like to pretend that positivism was thrown aside, cast away by the wayside long ago, and it's antiquated now. But the hallmarks of legal positivism you can see all over the criminal justice system, and it's behind a lot of the problems that we see. So I would suggest you check that out. You can get that episode of Foreign Policy Focus. I'll put it in the show notes page when it comes out, but otherwise go to thelibertarianinstitute.org or foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and check that out when it comes out. Otherwise, I'm going to be appearing on the Hapa Supremacy live stream, their YouTube channel. I'll throw that in the show notes page. That will be tomorrow night at 7:30 Central Time, so check that out. And I had to postpone my interview with Vinnie Marshall from Think Liberty until Sunday night. So I'll be doing that interview Sunday night. Look for that on Monday. And then I have another interview coming up. Let's see here. On Monday with Remso Martinez. He was just on the Free Man Beyond the Wall. But we'll be talking about his book, Beware the Libertarians. And so I'm excited for that. Got a lot of good stuff planned here. A lot of stuff going on. One thing I am worried about that I guess I kind of want to share with the audience is that I'm thinking about really putting the podcast on the back burner because I feel like I'm behind in my bar preparation. So I'm just putting the feelers out there. What I'm really afraid of is that if I stop putting out episodes, everyone will forget about me and forget that I exist. So if you want to encourage me or tell me that it's okay if I, take a little tiny break, please let me know. I would really appreciate that. A lot of the times, talking to the podcast audience is like talking to a brick wall, because right now I'm alone in my apartment. I'm speaking to a plastic thing that's mounted on my lap or on my monitor, so I don't get a lot of feedback. So please make your voice be known. Console me if you need to. Just say, hey, I love your show, or you don't have to say that, but just say, hey, it's okay if you take a break for a little bit. We understand. I just don't want y'all to go away. I feel like I've worked hard, and I don't want that to disappear. And I feel like if I stop putting out content regularly, y'all will go away. So yeah, but without further ado, let's get to the topic here today. This is has come up with the Roseanne Barr. She said something on Twitter that people on the left didn't like. So surprise, surprise. That kind of happens all the time. But she was fired. The show Roseanne was apparently like the #1 show on ABC. It was like, or something, the #1 hit show on ABC. And they hadn't had a hit show in a very long time, but they still decided to fire her for a comment she made about the Planet of the Apes, referring to someone who looked a lot like a character from Planet of the Apes. Anyways, the joke itself is kind of ridiculous, but libertarians get caught up in this free speech absolutism. And let me come across and just say, yeah, I support free speech, even though I don't think there's a right to free speech. And you'll find out why here in a second. There is no right to free speech. That doesn't mean that the government can censor people, because the government itself is illegitimate. So anything they do is illegitimate. If they restrict your freedom of speech, that's illegitimate. But what we're referring to is a right. What is a right? You know, rights all come from property rights. So people will talk about negative versus positive rights. The only rights that exist are negative rights. Your right to be left alone. Your right to not have something happen to you. Positive rights would require someone else to act in order for you to get something. So if you think that there's a right to education, you're wrong. If you think there's a right to water, you're implying that you have a right for someone to give you water that they own. Or if you are saying you have a right to education, then that means that someone has to facilitate that. If you have a right to free speech, if you think that you have a right to free speech, you're basically arguing that, hey, I can go onto someone's property and, you know, say whatever I want and they can't fire me. Or I had a libertarian on Facebook argue with me, and he said, you know, free speech is absolute. Like, you should be able to say whatever you want to say, even if your employer doesn't want you to, because I believe in freedom of speech. And I said, no, actually, I believe in censorship sometimes. And I said, you know, I don't want to go to the grocery store and then have the cashier berate me about how she's a vegan and about how I should be a vegan too. You know, I want the business owner to be able to fire her. And so that leads me to say that there is no right to free speech. If you voluntarily agree to be employed by someone, you don't have a right to say whatever you want. I think that if you did have a right to say whatever you want, then there would be an implication that everyone would have to listen to it or something like that. So private, that's what we get wrapped up in too, is that, okay, so private companies can discriminate, correct? Yes, of course they can. Does that mean that I have to like it if a private company does censor free speech? No, I don't have to. So, like, I agree that Twitter should be able to put people in Twitter jail if they want to, although I think it's stupid and I think they shouldn't. I agree they have the right to. That doesn't mean I support them all the time when they do that. So, yeah, we're getting into that issue of property rights. Where do rights come from? Well, it's based on who you kind of side with. I tend to be agreeing with Stefan Kinsella more recently, that Stefan, I'm not sure how he likes to pronounce his name, but I'm coming to this realization, you know, that natural rights doesn't have the answer all the time. I think that its philosophical founding is a little bit, it isn't encompassing enough. It isn't detailed enough. I like what Stefan Kinsella has done by integrating Hoppian argumentation ethics with natural law and homesteading. So he's kind of souped up, hybrided these ideas together in a theory that I think is very cohesive. And I don't have a site on me to what his ideas are, but if I find it after the fact, I'll put it in the show notes page. So you're right. All of what we find as being rights are really wrapped up in property rights. And I think a lot of ANCAP's voluntarists who are further along the path than others would recognize this, and they would agree with me. So my right to say whatever I want, you know, I guess I own my body, so therefore I can do what I want with my body as long as I'm on my own property. So everything stems from you owning yourself. If you want to say what you want, then you have to be on your property. So therefore there is no right to free speech. Likewise, and maybe I should have made an extra episode for this, but there is likewise no right to privacy. There is none. Maybe mainstream libertarians would be really upset with me for this. And let me say again, the government is illegitimate. they have no rights to do anything. So if the government is spying on me, well, because everything that the government has was taken by force or taken from someone else before me. So anything the government does is de facto illegitimate. When they spy on you, all the NSA stuff, that is all illegitimate. However, I could envision in a private property society that, well, first of all, in a private property or libertarian ANCAP society, the only foreseeable reason why someone would be spying on you is if they thought that you committed an offense against them personally, or maybe they're just spying on you, like they think you're cheating on their wife or something. Maybe they'd be spying on you then. So that would be an instance where they're not justified in doing so, in spying on you. But I would assume that in a private property society, the only reason someone would be spying on you is if they suspected you of committing something wrong against them. It's also foreseeable that they're a stalker too. Whereas if them spying on you, well, first of all, they would have to be, so your house, let's say that, someone is spying on you, there's a stalker. Your house is on this street. Well, there is no publicly owned spaces, so if there's someone that's stalking you, he's doing so from private property. And if you know the owner of that property, say it's the private, maybe it's the housing association that created your neighborhood that everyone voluntarily assented to when they bought property, then the housing association would be collectively, or the road outside your house would be collectively owned in a very limited, defined scope by people who live in your neighborhood. And if there's someone that's spying on you from the street, then in the private property society, you would just call up the dispute resolution agency. They would go out and accost the person who's spying on you, and they would go away. No one would be spying on your house to find out if there's drugs or if you're saying something bad about the government. That motivation would be gone. But say, that you are suspected of committing a crime. There's a private dispute resolution agency that you personally contract with to handle your disputes. And the reason why you do that is because, if someone hurts you, you want some kind of recourse. Or if you go into a contract and someone breaches the contract, you want representation and enforcement. So, because you want to be represented, you have the dispute agency yourself. If someone suspects you of committing a crime, then they would contact your dispute resolution agency and they would present their case and say, hey, this person probably stole from me. I can prove it. I can meet this burden. You should go check it out. And this private dispute resolution agency has agreed with you beforehand that they can, request things of you if someone suspects you of a crime, but they have to meet a certain burden, right? They have to kind of prove it. And you would agree to this because, if the tables were reversed, you would expect the same kind of treatment. And so that's how the Fourth Amendment search and seizure stuff, that's how I envision it working out in a private property society, is that, you want protection, therefore you agree that if someone suspects you, there are certain burdens they have to meet. But if they meet that burden, then your own representative security agency could, come. You've agreed beforehand that they can come and search you for a very narrowly defined object. And that policy, I think, would all settle itself out just through supply and demand. That litigants would, they would select dispute resolution agencies that have rules that they like, whether that's for, accusing someone else or defending yourself. I really don't foresee a problem there. And I really don't worry about these private dispute resolution agencies working with each other because, there's going to be jurisdictional issues where people from two different agencies have a conflict, and those agencies will have figured out how to deal with that conflict. And choice of law and jurisdiction stuff I really am not worried about either, because the court system have dealt with that problem since antiquity, really. That's kind of a function of courts. So, well, in this episode, I've kind of gone from, there is no right to free speech, you don't have a right to free speech, to the Fourth Amendment issue as well. Another example that I wanted to think of is you don't own your likeness either. So if you, and this is a little more complicated, if you go out into public and someone takes a picture of you, well, and say they post it somewhere, that's kind of a dignitary harm. They haven't really aggressed against your person or property. So theoretically, in a libertarian society, someone takes a picture of you and they want to use it for certain purposes. You don't really have a recourse because that's more of a dignitary harm. Unless you can own the image of yourself, I don't think that doesn't really make sense to me in terms of property rights. And well, my ideas on the subject aren't like fully developed, so this is just me postulating. But I've thought about this a lot, especially in defamation cases, because there is a First Amendment implication. I think the seminal case on that has to do with New York, that defamation case. So yeah, if someone takes a picture of you, that's not defamation, by the way, but conceivably in an ANCAP society, you go out on the street, someone takes a picture of you. Well, you're not in a public space. See, all this gets complicated when public spaces exist. But if you walk out on the street corner, someone takes a picture of you, and you don't like it, well, whoever owns that private space, they probably have a rule about photography. And if someone takes your picture without your permission, they're on that private property when they did it. Well, you could conceivably, maybe that's where your remedy comes from, is that you take them to court and you say, hey, you took a picture of me when you were on private property, and the rules of that private property were there was no taking pictures here. And by, when you came on the private property, the rules were posted. And then that kind of has a problem, though, with there being all these private property, all these areas of private property, and if you transition from one area of private property to another, then there's an argument to be made that, like, how do people know what the rules are when they go from one private property to another? That might be a problem, unless there's just a bunch of unless there's like 5 really well-known dispute resolution agencies, and they all have different sets of rules, and when you enter a different piece of private property, it's posted what dispute resolution agency has jurisdiction there. And maybe you're just supposed to know when you enter a certain area what rules that they have. But likewise, when you travel across the United States, it's not abundantly clear what rules are in which jurisdiction when you cross state lines. Like, when you cross state lines, it doesn't say, okay, these are felonies in the state of South Carolina, so be posted and be aware. Or private property functions like this when you enter South Carolina. So maybe that won't really be an issue, but I'm very confident in the court's ability to solve these problems. So, well, I want to close this up here. Mostly the purpose of this episode was to make everyone aware of the appearances that I'm having coming up, and also to check out that episode of Foreign Policy Focus. Also, though, just always think of things in terms of property rights. That's always what it boils down to, really. But when it comes to, do we have a right to free speech? Well, the answer is no. I mean, you do on your property. You have a right to do whatever the hell you want on your property. But do you have the right to free speech? No. Especially when you're hired by someone else. You don't. And I think there's good reason for that. And there's situations in which that you would not prefer free speech. Like I said at the grocery store. I don't want the cashier belittling me about the fact that I'm not a vegan. So in that case, I am pro-censorship, I think my reason why I'm not like super thrilled about the First Amendment either is because I get I'm so annoyed by what other people have to say sometimes, And like when I became a libertarian, I was on the University of Minnesota campus and had to put up with a lot of shenanigans and a lot of irritating stuff. So other people's opinions annoy me usually. Of course, I'm referring to leftists mostly, just on campus and stuff like that. So yes, there is no right to freedom of speech. There's no clear private property right to freedom of speech, and there's no clear private property right to privacy either. So those are two pitfalls that I think libertarians get into. But yes, at the end of the day, we always do not like government action, and when they attempt to abridge freedom of speech or freedom of privacy, that's a no-no, because they're illegitimate. So, all right, you know how to support the Liberty Weekly podcast. That is at patreon.com/Liberty Weekly. Here you can get, actually I'm just about to post the extras from my conversation with Kyle. There's about 30 minutes extra of conversing that we participated in, and you can access that by being a patron. Otherwise, I'm loading a bunch of memes into the meme cache, new memes that I've come across. You get access to that at the $5 a month level. The Ludwig von Memeses access. Terrible puns all around. The second one is the Murray Rothbard access, which is access to the Rothbard repository created by Daniel from Actual Anarchy, containing a whole archive of Murray Rothbard lectures that are indexed and searchable by timestamp. So that is a good resource for us at $10 a month. Also, show notes or show extras and early access you get access to as well. So you can see everything in the feed here. Here's a whole like extra episode that I did talking about the books that I like. Coincidentally, wearing the same shirt, but it's not winter anymore. So check that out. The Amazon affiliate link as well. Oh, and one note before I forget about the Supreme Court decision, the Masterpiece Cake. I didn't talk about like what comes after this decision, the implicated results of this decision, but the Supreme Court left the door open on this issue. They said that it was wrong that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission unfairly discriminated against Mr. Phillips, therefore violating the free exercise clause. But they didn't close the possibility. That begs the question, well, what happens if the Colorado Civil Rights Commission compels speech without being discriminatory to sincerely held religious beliefs? What if they ruled in favor of of Mr. Phillips? They ruled in favor of him, what if the Colorado Civil Rights Commission ruled against Mr. Phillips, but in ruling against him, they weren't unduly unfair to his sincerely held religious beliefs? What then? You know, what happens then? And I think the implication is that, well, the gay cakes would win then in that situation, and that's still unconstitutional according to the compelled speech doctrine. So, all right, well, thanks everyone. I think that is all. Trying to think of anything else. No. So that was, again, libertyweekly.net/81, and we'll be back. I think I'm going to load my appearance from Hapa Supremacy into the podcast feed. And so keep your eye out for that video. There's also a video for this in the show notes page at libertyweekly.net/81. And really looking forward to it, guys. So have a great weekend. This should be coming out tonight, Thursday night, or Friday morning.